Nintendo Nation.
Unknown Fate is one of the more interesting indie games I have played. Indie generally conjures images of 2D platformers or maybe top-down action-adventure games. 3D games in general are few and far between, and first-person games seem to be the one genre that has the least representation amongst indie titles. Marslit Games, the brother tandem from Italy and the developer of Unknown Fate, have taken a huge risk with their first foray into game development. And in general, they have succeeded. The story focuses on Richard, a man that has found himself in an obscure world with no indication or memory of how he arrived there. There are characters introduced that don't make a whole lot of sense at first, or maybe even longer depending on how closely you can follow what's happening. There's the woman in white, the guardian, more guardians, a dog that also turns out to be, well, I'll leave that one alone, and mysterious creatures that appear and come to life out of nowhere. One of the more interesting parts of the game, both in terms of story and artistically, is the flashback memory world. Here, everything is in black and white, and the people have been mostly blacked out to make for a really interesting and compelling look. Richard relives these memories through his different perspectives, first as a child, then an adolescent, then a young adult. These flashback memories at first don't have much meaning, but by the end of the game they begin to make much more sense, eventually becoming the basis behind Richard's character arc. All of this leads to some pretty cool moments of clarity for Richard and the player, as more is revealed about his traumatic past and how he has struggled to let go of things he couldn't control and things he blamed himself for. The Guardians, who appear to be caretakers of this strange world, are quite well done, and offer Richard advice and guidance throughout his journey. They also appear in the flashbacks in subtle ways that really make the player question what's happening. To progress the story, Richard must traverse the landscape with the use of the artifact, a glowing orb that grants different uses. Simple puzzle solving and platforming becomes more complex as you progress and the artifact's 3 forms are unlocked. The world is divided mostly into 3 different aesthetics. Each has a unique feel with different items littered throughout to indicate a time in Richard's life. The first world has blocks, picket fences, and other childhood reminders. Later on, there is a world with pencils and paper, ink bottles, and cassette tapes, perhaps to indicate school-aged Richard. Then there are the half-lit cigarettes and brightly lit computer screens in another world, indicating a stressed man at work. The story and the world building are the most interesting things about Unknown Fate. If I could review this game based simply on those, it would receive a very high grade. But there is more to the game, and it's unfortunately not all good. The game's shortcomings are in the gameplay itself, where there isn't much variety and there isn't much attention to detail or polish. The game has some real problems when it comes to the simple things. To start, there are many times during the game where some sort of auto-aim would be beneficial. I understand that the game was developed on PC first, so perhaps these things should be forgiven, designed for a mouse and keyboard after all, but the lack of auto-aim on the console version makes for very unsatisfying gameplay. Shooting at platforms or enemies is difficult, and the aiming controls are jerky at best. I got used to it during my playthrough, but I can't overlook how much better the game would play with a simple magnetism towards the targets. And when it comes to enemies, it's another dud. The lack of auto-aim and the lack of any sort of collision sounds make fighting enemies a very unrewarding experience, one that was simply a nuisance more than anything else. There are quality of life problems beyond this. For example, there are traversal problems with jumping and getting stuck on ledges. I fell through the map once and had to restart. When you miss a jump and the game takes you back to the previous checkpoint, you often aren't facing in the proper direction. These are things I expect that with more experience, Marslit will be able to work out with their next game, but for Unknown Fate, it can lead to a frustrating experience. The soundtrack for the game is okay. Each world has a unique track or 2 that repeats throughout. My favorite was the third world, where there's a soothing piano track, but unfortunately I must mention that the English voice acting is not good. The actor that plays Richard is not convincing, to put it lightly. Some of the others, like the Guardians, are much better, but I can't help but feel if Richard had been cast a bit better, the voice acting as a whole would be raised. On top of the actual acting, there are some audio problems where the voice acting is very quiet in comparison to the rest of the game sounds. That's the attention to detail that I feel the game lacks. Despite the many problems the game suffers from, I found myself enjoying the game, completely invested in seeing it to the end. The story comes together very nicely, revealing what Richard's struggles and memories were all about. And after the third artifact power unlocks, the puzzle solving becomes fun and more varied. For their first attempt at a video game, I think Marslit Games should be very proud of what they have accomplished. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But the game has a certain something about it that should be applauded, and many gamers will likely appreciate. It has a complex and compelling story with a satisfying end. The gameplay, though not amazing, improves with each artifact power-up. There is incredibly interesting world and character design that should be applauded and revered. What Unknown Fate does well, it does really, really well. It's unfortunate that the flaws are also just as apparent. But despite the game's shortcomings, I think this is a game worth playing. It only takes about 6 hours to complete, but I think the message at the end of the game and how it all ties together is really satisfying. Some might not be able to get past the clumsy controls, but if you can, you'll likely enjoy a very unique and interesting experience. The verdict is, recommend.